Let's begin.
I'd first like to say thank you to Fred for organizing this, and to Frank Macchiarola for lending us this lovely space. It's nice to be back in the borough of my birth, the borough of my parents' birth, and it's nice to see my brother, who lives here as well. He's a retired police sergeant and a graduate of St. Francis. It's nice to see Michael, who I knew somewhat in the 90s. And so let's get going. I think the best way to start, I'd like to take you all back on a little trip in time. We're heading back to the year 1972. It was a somewhat analogous period to today. The U.S. was involved in a divisive and somewhat disappointing military intervention overseas, and there was a polarizing culture war at home, though instead of red state versus blue state, it was hippies versus hard hats, or hard hats versus hippies. And into that fraught breach stepped William F. Buckley's National Review, the very Bible of conservatism. In September 1972, National Review published an article about the Times with the headline, "Is it true what they say about the Times?" It was co-written by John Ottinger and Patrick Maines, one a former reporter at the New York World Telegram, the other the assistant of National Review. At that time, Spiro Agnew was railing against the elitist establishment press and the nattering nabobs of negatism, incidentally a phrase written by William Safire, who soon thereafter went to work for the Times as their in-house conservative op-ed columnist. Richard Nixon was livid over the Times publication of the Pentagon Papers, and conservatives everywhere, some Democrats too, were upset by the looming Times endorsement of George McGowan. The focus of the National Review article were charges of left-leaning bias. Conservatives had long dismissed the Times as a hotbed of liberalism, bias beyond redemption. But, the National Review asked, to what extent was this impression soundly based? It essentially examined 5 issues that they said fell along a left-right cleft. They were Senator James Buckley's 1970 run for his Senate seat, the anti-ballistic missile treaty and vote in 1969, the failed Supreme Court nomination of federal appellate court judge Clement Haynsworth, and President Nixon's decision to mine the harbors of North Vietnam, including Haiphong. The National Review concluded, surprisingly, that were the news standards of the Times more broadly emulated, particularly by news magazines and broadcast networks, the nation would be far better informed and more honorably served. Now, this was clearly a tribute to the journalism practiced and upheld by Abe Rosenthal, who was then executive editor of the New York Times. He was executive editor from 1969 to 1986. It was a journalism based on professional detachment, as much as possible, impartiality, agnosticism. Rosenthal was determined to keep the paper straight. He once told Joe Lelyveld that it was important to keep a firm right hand on the tiller because the newsroom would naturally drift to the left. He believed that there should be no editorial needles in which reporters used their personal political opinions to go after anybody. He believed that there should be no pejorative quotes that were either unattributed or made somebody look bad that weren't fair. Rosenthal was very patriotic, and he was extremely wary of the counterculture. And he was also very wary of conflicts of interest amongst his reporters. When he found out that a woman he had hired had once had an affair with a politician in Philadelphia, I believe it may have been the mayor, he famously fired her and said, and I'll pay deference to the fact that this is a Catholic institution, I don't care if my reporters bleep the elephants, but if they do, they can't cover the circus. So let's fast forward a bit. It's 2003. In the wake of the Jason Blair plagiarism scandal, TV comedians are having a field day. David Letterman said, "You know the old slogan of the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print? Well, they've got a new one. They've changed it. The new slogan is, we make it up." In the summer of 2004, Daniel Okrent, who was the paper's first public editor or reader's advocate, an office that was created in response to the Jason Blair scandal, published a column headlined, "Is the Times a Liberal Newspaper?" He answered that question in his lead, with, "Of course it is," said Okrent. "If you think the Times plays it down the middle on divisive social issues, you're reading the paper with your eyes closed." Indeed, in October 2004, just a few months after Okrent's column, Jay Nordlinger of the National Review, echoing many conservatives, wrote a repudiation of that pro-New York Times 1972 article advocating going timesless. This is certainly a far cry from that 72 article and Buckley's oft-stated assertion that doing without the Times would be like going without arms and legs. There were a lot of other controversial issues in 2005, 2006. There were charges that the Times was a treasonous organization for publishing scoops on the National Security Agency's electronic surveillance of terrorism and terrorists and terrorism suspects, both at home and abroad. There were demonstrations outside the Times that called the New York Times the Al Jazeera Times. And then in 2010, we have the WikiLeaks. And we have WikiLeaks, and particularly its Cablegate, the dump of State Department diplomatic cables. Again, there were accusations of treason, denouncements, proclamations of possible prosecutions from officials, probably blowing smoke for public consumption. Let me say right here, I don't advocate going timeless in the least. I don't think the Times is treasonous, although I don't think its sense of post-national patriotism is the same as traditional notions of patriotism, and I think we'll get that into that a little later. I certainly don't think it should be bombed, as Ann Coulter once thundered. I've read the Times since I was a kid. I was very proud, very early in my career, to be published very prominently in it. I consider the Times an important national resource, albeit an endangered one, and I confess to being one of those New Yorkers who refer to it simply as the paper. Pre-internet, I'd wander down to the local newsstand to get the next day's edition. If I was out of town and couldn't find it, I'd get withdrawal symptoms. But I'd say sadly, those days, that young man and that New York Times are gone. For generations, the Times was considered the gold standard of American journalism, and the institution was considered central to the public discourse and policy debates at the core of our democracy and our shared civic life. Yet, I don't think for this generation the Times could be called what Dwight McDonald said it was for his generation, which was the principal point of contact with the real world. Nor can it be seen, I think, as Gay Talese once put it, as necessary proof of the world's existence, a barometer of its pressure, an assessor of its sanity. Indeed, some may not care. Some may think the Times are relevant in this age of media hyperchoice, but I think it's more necessary than ever, largely because much of the new media don't have the resources or talent and money that the Times does, nor the authority. That might be changing. Nor can they provide the common narrative we need as a nation and a neutral form of establishing what's true and what's not. These times still might demand the Times, but they certainly demand a much better Times than we're getting. A lot of people focus on the decline of the Times by citing some of the big ticket scandals, institutional blunders, and financial problems. I rather focus on the everyday reporting. I think, to be sure, the Times still can produce impressive journalism, and it can serve democracy quite well. It was excellent on the BP oil spill. I think it served democracy quite well by showing some of the diplomatic and strategic blunders of the Bush administration in the first couple of years of the Iraq intervention. I think it's been pretty good on the plight of ordinary people during this recession. I don't think it's been particularly good on Obama's solutions to the recession, but I think it's humanized and brought home the suffering and ordeal that a lot of people are going through.